I declare the meeting closed at 3:30 and it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our special guest in Alex Ryvchin. I've had the opportunity of meeting with him personally at a previous get-together and found his intellect and his knowledge and what he stands for is nothing short of brilliant. So we're very lucky to have Alex join us today and give us his presentation. Just as I say, as a refresher of your knowledge of him. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He is a writer, speaker, commentator on the Arab-Israel conflict, international affairs, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. His first book was the internationally acclaimed The Anti-Israel Agenda, Inside a Political War on the Jewish State. His more recent book, Zionism, A Concise History. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alex Ryvchin, and there he is. Welcome, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a terrific delight to be with you all this afternoon. I only wish I could be there in person because Perth is a city that's very close to my heart, but it's great to see you through the screen nonetheless. So first of all, I want to thank Kevin for that lovely introduction, and also Phil Samuel, Steve Lieblick, Graham Leonard, Craig, Joanna, Ian and Melanie, and all of the leadership group. I'd like to thank and acknowledge Simon Millman, MLA, who is a terrific friend of the community and of Israel, and we should all be grateful for Simon's role in securing vital funding for the Perth community. I also want to acknowledge Kate Doust, Bob Kuchera, Glenn Sturr, Melanie Jones for their patronage and their friendship. And of course, I want to commend and congratulate the outgoing chair, Kevin Campbell, for his outstanding, tireless and astute leadership. And I want to welcome and congratulate Dr. Sherry Sufi, a great friend and a worthy successor and a leader of this wonderful organization. And I want to sincerely thank everyone who's here today and who's been involved in Friends of Israel WA, whether in a leadership capacity or as a member. This genuinely bipartisan group has been so effective in building both political and popular support for Israel. And truly, it is one of the most successful and impactful communal organizations in the country. And you should all be immensely proud of the work that you do. The reason why this organization, in my view, has been so successful for so long is because at the heart of everything that you do is something that is far greater than partisan politics. You are driven always by a desire to stand up for and defend the rights of the Jewish people. And the State of Israel and Zionism are the embodiment and the fulfillment of the rights of the Jewish people to equality, to self-determination, and indeed survival. And so I thank you all for what you do. And this then brings me neatly to the topic of my talk today, which is about Zionism and my new book, Zionism, The Concise History. As Kevin mentioned in his very generous introduction, my first book came out in 2017. It was called The Anti-Israel Agenda Inside the Political War on the Jewish State. And when I wrote that book, I was determined to expose the assault on Israel for the sake of truth and for the welfare of the Jewish people. I wanted to inspire and prepare new advocates and activists, and I wanted to equip the reading public with the facts and knowledge they need to understand what this conflict is really all about. But I think more than all that, I was compelled by my upbringing as a Soviet Jew, with an acute awareness of the daily cruelties and injustices to which my people were subject, and to now use my position as a citizen of a free country to stand up and to hit back. My new book is very much a continuation of that mission, but it also came in response to a very specific problem. It had become apparent to me, as no doubt it is to all of you, that the word Zionist has been stripped of its true meaning and has instead become a word of infamy and curse. Somehow the movement that sought to liberate or at least shelter the Jewish people from anti-Semitism, which has seen them hounded and humiliated and burned in every generation, somehow the movement that sought nothing more than a scrap of land for the Jews to call their own so that they and their contributions to humanity should not vanish from this earth, somehow this has become akin to racism, to Nazism, to imperialism, to colonialism, to white supremacism, and every other popular conception of evil known today. These are lies that cannot be allowed to be laundered into truth, because the consequence of allowing this deliberate distortion of Zionism to take place is that new generations will only ever know of Zionism and Zionists as an evil to be fought. And when Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people, when it is the foundational movement of the Jewish state, this will be a fight that will ensnare Jews of the left and of the right, religious and secular, in Israel and the diaspora, without distinction, like all assaults on the Jewish people before it. So this is why I felt that a book explaining Zionism, the events that defined it, the leaders that shaped it, and the present challenges to it, both internal and external, was so badly needed. And in seeking to write this book, I initially planned to present it as a direct rebuttal of the most pervasive and damaging accusations leveled against Zionists today. That Zionism is racism, a lie declared to be truth by the UN General Assembly on the 10th of November 1975. Or that the Zionists were in cahoots, in league with the Nazis, an outrageous claim popularized by the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, a couple of years ago, to the extent that Hitler plus Zionist was a top Google search in the UK for the time. Or the claim made by one of the founders of the Women's March in the US, with the deliberate aim of purging Jews from progressive movements, that Zionism is incompatible with feminism. And while my book addresses all of that, it seemed to me that the best way to demystify Zionism, the best way to reclaim Zionism, and the best way to debunk the slander deliberately and strategically leveled against it was not to act as the public defender of Zionism against its accusers, but to simply tell the story of Zionism in a manner that was sincere, honest, and clear, aimed at an audience of those willing to listen. And I'm confident that everyone who reads this book will come away with a better understanding of what Zionism is, what it isn't, why it's inextricably linked to every phase of Jewish history, and therefore forms a fundamental part of Jewish identity. So how do we correctly understand Zionism? Zionism can be defined simply as support for the right of the Jewish people to exercise national self-determination in some part of their ancestral homeland. And it emerges in its modern form in the late 19th century with the aim of ingathering some of the Jews who've been scattered throughout the world into a single national polity through which they could freely determine their own political status and safeguard and enlarge those things that make the Jewish people distinct: their language, their culture, their history, their traditions, their heritage, their religion. But if we really want to understand Zionism, we have to understand the concepts that are at its core. And the first such concept is the idea of Jewish peoplehood. And by this I mean that the Jews, aside from being linked by our monotheistic faith and the texts and traditions that come from it, also form a distinct ethnic and national group. We are a people, and we attained this condition of peoplehood by virtue of originating from a single place, a place where we developed the Hebrew language, a place where we developed national traditions based on glorious battles and deep tragedies, a place where we developed our poetry and literature, and a place where we developed our greatest gift to the world, the ethics derived from the Jewish religion. And so the second concept is absolutely central to understanding Zionism is connection to land. Now, this is not something unique to the Jewish people. Indigenous peoples throughout the world, including our own Indigenous Australians, feel deep emotional and spiritual ties to the lands in which they became a people, the lands in which they are Indigenous. And for the Jewish people, that land has always been what we have known as Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, what later became Palestine, and what is again now known as Israel. And those who have attempted to thwart Zionism, to eradicate any autonomous Jewish presence from the Middle East, have also understood the importance of this connection, which is precisely why they've sought to erase it. We have seen in contemporary times Palestinian-led campaigns and UN agencies aimed at denying the Jewish connection to Hebron or to Jerusalem, to the Cave of the Patriarchs and the Western Wall. We've seen leading Palestinian officials claim that the existence of two Jewish temples in Jerusalem was a myth. And this happened in ancient times as well. When the Emperor Hadrian put down the final Jewish rebellion in the year 135 CE, he not only slaughtered hundreds of thousands, scattering many more throughout the vast lands of the Roman Empire, hoping they would soon forget their homes. He prohibited entry of Jews into Jerusalem on pain of death. He erected a pagan temple on the ruins of the Jewish temple. He renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and he renamed Judea Syria Palestinia, believing that by destroying the holy sites, by scattering the people, by even renaming their lands, he could break the bonds of peoplehood and nationhood, and the Jews would simply vanish among the peoples where they had come to live. But the Jews would never forget Zion. Now no longer something to be possessed and touched, it came instead to animate their dreams and visions and inhabit their entire worldly consciousness. There is so much to talk about in the story of Zionism, but today I want to focus on three aspects of it. Firstly, the justness of Zionism, secondly, its necessity, and thirdly, its capacity to inspire. So firstly, to the justness of Zionism. When the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, it resulted in a manifesto, a clear document which expressed in concise terms exactly what Zionism stood for and what it sought to achieve. And that was to establish a national home for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, secured under public law. It would not be through war, it would not be through the displacement of others, it would be through the law. And for a people who had lived for nearly 2,000 years subject to the whims and fancies of those who ruled over them, whose inferior status had often been enshrined in the law, only by achieving international legal recognition of their human and national rights could the Jews hope to achieve their equality. And so the first major international recognition of the legitimacy of Zionism came in the form of the Balfour Declaration, issued by the British on the 2nd of November 1917, at a time when the British and their allies were liberating the colonies of the Ottoman Empire, and it pledged British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in the land that Hadrian had renamed Palestine. Now, it would later become a point of debate as to whether the Balfour Declaration was itself a legal promise, but this would really pass into the realm of academic interest only, as in subsequent years the precise wording and terms of the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into a series of treaties and other instruments of law, which without a doubt had binding legal effect. So first you have the Covenant of the League of Nations, which establishes the mandatory system under which the victorious allies in World War I, the great powers, would act as custodians of the liberated colonies of the Ottoman Empire until such time as the native peoples could stand on their own. And this was one of the requirements of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which called for the decolonization and autonomous development of these lands. Then at San Remo in April 1920, Britain is appointed mandatory for Palestine with the express obligation of bringing about a Jewish national home in the land. You then have the treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne with the vanquished Turks, which again incorporates the wording of the Balfour Declaration. And when the League of Nations, which is the forerunner to the UN, formally adopted the League of Nations mandate for Palestine in 1922, this had the effect, in the words of Chaim Weizmann, of converting the earlier promises from a policy position into an international legal obligation recognized by the international community as a whole. When Israel declared independence on the 14th of May 1948, this was the last step in a long and comprehensive legal process, which, as Alan Dershowitz writes in the introduction to my book, gives Israel the most legitimate birth certificate of any modern democracy. As Winston Churchill said, it is manifestly right and fair that the Jews scattered throughout the world should have a national home and center where some of them may be reunited. And where else can that be but in the land with which for more than 3,000 years they've been intimately and profoundly associated. The necessity of Zionism has been proven and continues to be proven before our eyes. In fact, it's difficult to think of another political theory that has been proven as definitively as the idea that the Jews require a national home to secure their survival. Long before the Nazi period, the Roman Empire, the Church, nationalist figures like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, cultural titans like Martin Luther, had all imprinted on the collective psyche a characterization of the Jews that made the Holocaust possible, even inevitable. Luther had called the Jews thirsty bloodhounds and murderers of all Christendom. They poisoned water and wells, stole children and tore and hacked them apart. In 1895, decades before the world had even heard of Hitler, the Speaker of the German Parliament called the Jews cholera germs. And what is to be done with such a thing but to destroy it? As the historian Yehuda Bauer said, one does not argue with parasites. Israel was not formed because of the Holocaust. Israel is not a burden dropped on the heads of the Arabs to atone for European guilt. As we have seen, the legitimacy of Zionism had been established long before the war period. But the Holocaust, which saw the army of a sophisticated nation traverse the European continent, with the mission of extinguishing every last Jewish life, aided by collaborationist governments and populations and police forces in virtually every place it entered, did have a profound impact on the course of Zionism. It served to prove, without question, that a national home for the Jewish people was not only a legal right, it was an existential necessity. And one need only ask the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Assyrians, the Kurds, the persecuted and abandoned peoples of the world today, what it means to be stateless in an international system dominated by self-interest, sloth, and parsimony. Finally, to the wonder of Zionism and its capacity to inspire. The story of Zionism is the story of an ancient people who by all rational reckonings should have ceased to exist as a distinct people centuries ago. And yet somehow through 2 millennia of exile, of pogroms, of inquisitions, of forced conversions and expulsions, they endured, retained their sense of peoplehood and culture, formed a national movement that was coherent and compelling, and achieved the physical return of its people to the lands from which they'd been exiled 2,000 years before. This is a story without precedent and without successor. And when we delve deeper into the story of Zionism, its defining moments, its leaders, we see all the more how wondrous and incredible it is. Take, for example, the Dreyfus Affair. You have a French army officer arrested, tried, wrongly convicted, and incarcerated on a distant island prison for passing military secrets to the Germans. And this happens not because he's guilty, but because, as the chief investigator would tell the French foreign minister, his Jewish race has made him suspect for a long time. And all the while, the real traitor, a petty swindler and gambler by the name of Ferdinand Esterhazy, goes free. Now, this story of race and inequality, of miscarriage of justice, would captivate France. But how would the plight of one wretched army officer impact on the future of the Jewish people? Because observing the public degradation of Dreyfus and the mob of Frenchmen outside the courtroom chanting "Death to Dreyfus and death to the Jews" was the 34-year-old Paris correspondent of a Viennese newspaper who had come to report on the trial. And he'd been contemplating for a long time how to alleviate the suffering of the Jewish people. And in the Dreyfus trial, he witnessed a matinee performance of the very ideas and theories he'd been tinkering with, which served to rudely dislodge his previous view that by being good, loyal citizens, something that Dreyfus exemplified, the Jews of Europe would be safe. And that man was, of course, Theodor Herzl, the founding father of modern Zionism. And within 6 months of the Dreyfus trial, he would pen the first draft of the seminal text of Zionism, the Jewish state. And within a couple of years, he would convene that first Zionist Congress in Basel, an event so significant that Herzl would later reflect, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state." Another great Jewish writer, Israel Zangwill, also reflected on that momentous gathering and wrote, "By the river Babylon, we sat down and there we wept, for we remembered Zion. And by the river Basel, we sat down and we resolved to weep no more." And then you have the British in urgent need of the chemical compound acetone to mix with gunpowder to reduce the smoke given off by their heavy guns so as not to reveal their positions to the Germans in their naval battles in World War I. And I can practically hear you all wondering, what the hell does that have to do with Zionism and the story of the Jewish people? Because the man who discovered the formula for the mass production of acetone, all while experimenting into something totally different, was a Russian Jew. A lecturer in organic chemistry at the University of Manchester, he'd attended the second Zionist Congress, also in Basel, had been mesmerized by Herzl and was devoted to the Zionist cause. And that man would become the first president of the state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. And through his work in acetone, Weizmann would come into the company of Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty. And he would meet David Lloyd George, who was then Minister for Munitions and would become Prime Minister. And he would meet a chap by the name of Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, who would say of his conversations with Weizmann about Zionism in this period, "It is a great cause and I understand it." David Lloyd George would reflect in his war memoirs that his conversations with Weizmann about Zionism during this time were the fount and origin of the Balfour Declaration. And then you have the Ottoman authorities in Palestine expelling 18,000 Jews in 1914, and this would end up materially aiding the cause of Zionism. Why? Because 14,000 of those 18,000 Jews would end up in the Egyptian port city of Alexandria, where by chance the British and our Anzacs and their allies would soon arrive by convoy via the Suez Canal, bound for the battlefields of Turkey. And there, two of the exiled Jews, Zev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor, would impress upon the British the benefits of forming the first regular Jewish fighting force since the rebellion against Hadrian in the year 135 CE. And that outfit, which was called the Zion Mule Corps, saw action in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, including Gallipoli, and would be placed under the command of a British officer by the name of John Henry Patterson, who, through his contact with these vigorous and patriotic Jewish men, would become an important lifelong devotee to the Zionist cause. And the great Israeli historian, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who in time would father Israel's longest-serving prime minister, would name his first son, Yoni, or Jonathan, in honor of his friend and the commander of the Zion Mule Corps, John Henry Patterson. And Yoni Netanyahu would of course go on to attain his own legendary status, falling in the heroic commando raid on Entebbe in 1976. The story of Zionism is not merely the story of the founding of the State of Israel. It is the story of a people's survival through a sheer will to remain and endure. It is the story of leaders possessed with a rare vision and a political genius that turned a shapeless yearning to go home into a precise political concept capable of being implemented within the norms and systems of the day. And it's a story colored as much by its villains as by its heroes. Death certificates on white papers, grand muftis and Nazi executioners played as much a part in the story of Zionism as did Herzl, Weizmann and Ben-Gurion. And it's a story that continues to be written with no end in sight. As Israelis debate, as Lincoln did for America at Gettysburg, what their national project truly means. And the enemies of Zionism steel themselves for a war they have yet to conceive. Thank you very much.
It's Kevin here, Alex. Thank you for that. And for that presentation, you can see why Alex is recognised, the writer, the commentator, the lawyer, all wrapped in one, and his wonderful presentation with his extreme knowledge of his subject. So congratulations and thank you. Alex, we did say that there was going to be the opportunity for some questions, and we're going to allow that, and with the appropriate technology, Alex may not be able to see who is actually standing and putting the question, but if I can ask, Steve, are you going to handle the questions? Can you hear Steve, Alex? Can you hear me?
I can hear you faintly. I can't hear Steve at all. I can see Steve.
Okay, just
beautiful man that he is.
Just stand by and
well, I think that's all we've got. So let's see how we go.
okay.
You want to just relay the questions to me, Steve?
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, I'll repeat the question to you if you can't hear the speaker.
Sure thing.
Okay. Are you going to share this or?
I'll share this and then I'll ask Graham Sherry. Yes. So, okay, can we have a question? Yes, please. We have one announced, Michael.
Yeah. Alex, can you hear me?
Why don't you come,
Come over here.
Whoever wants to ask a question,
Sorry,
just come
that
up
seems
here.
to be the answer.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for the very concise and illuminating talk you just gave to us.
Thank you.
Can you please comment a little bit on this new peace agreement between Israel and the UAE? Just give us a bit of background and information and what led to it and what you think the prospects of the immediate future are going to be. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Look, it's a wonderful thing. It's a momentous thing. And some people, some analysts and some think tanks have tried to downplay its significance. I think this is an enormous development. The UAE will become the third country after Egypt and Jordan to establish full diplomatic relations and recognition of Israel, which is momentous. It opens the door to other Gulf states, Bahrain, perhaps Kuwait, countries like Oman, Sudan, to perhaps recognize Israel in the near future as well. And there are a lot of factors that play, a lot of dynamics. And the main thing that I take from it is this announcement. It really vindicates the approach and the thinking of Benjamin Netanyahu. Whatever one thinks of his politics, I think this has been an enormous victory for him. He has said for a long time that he will be able to cleave away the Palestinian issue from broader Israeli-Arab engagement. And his dad has said that the Arab world would never engage with Israel or recognize Israel until the Palestinian issue is resolved first. And he has proven them wrong. I think another major dynamic that was at play here was, of course, Iran. And the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, are acutely conscious of the malevolence of the Iranian mullahs. They fear that regime. They fought bloody proxy wars in Syria and in Yemen as well. They see what Hezbollah has done to Lebanon, and they're extremely fearful of that regime. And what do they see? They see the Americans in the previous administration sidling up to the Iranians, draping an arm over Zarif, the smiling foreign minister. They see European leaders coming to embrace Iran, give them a massive sanctions windfall of $150 billion, which allowed them to deepen their dark hand in the region. And the one man who stood up to them with greatest clarity and force and determination and conviction was the Israeli Prime Minister. And the Gulf states saw this, and they realized that in Israel they have a potential ally, and they've been establishing clandestine relations for a number of years, allowing Israel to fly over their airspace, secret meetings of ministers, more public meetings more recently. So this has been looming for a long time. And I think whatever one thinks of the politics of Benjamin Netanyahu and also Donald Trump, this is an incredible victory and vindication of their approach and their thinking on the region.
Another question, yes, please. Can you maybe come up here? So, yeah.
Alex, can you hear us from here?
I can.
Okay, good. Stand here.
Alex, it's wonderful to have opportunity to talk directly to you.
Thank
I have
you.
something that is consuming lots of time of my thoughts and hurt me very much. It's 1 year that happened some terrible, terrible attacks of anti-Semitism in high schools in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah.
And I have been reading into the Maccabean Australian Jewish News and newsletters from organizations of people that will do this and will do that. And in the end, I receive reports that nothing can be done. And it was appalling. I feel very hurt by what these boys have been through in the schools, by the irresponsibility of the principals, but nothing was being done in the education department. And I trust so much the leaders of the organizations, national and in every state. And I feel like we are slipping away and we not effective in any way, and we accepting this terrible, terrible reality. And I would like to have your point of view on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's something that's troubled all of us for a long time. And the incidents that we saw come out of those public schools in Melbourne were particularly jarring and shocking, but it was really just the tip of the iceberg. And we have anecdotal evidence of a number of years throughout the country of these sorts of incidents occurring frequently in public and private schools, of harassment of Jewish students, of Holocaust jokes, all sorts of ugly things that are happening, online harassment and bullying. The thing is, we must acknowledge that anti-Semitism and ignorance and human stupidity and malice and bullying, these are sadly incurable conditions. They exist and have existed and will always exist. So there's no way to absolutely protect our community and our people from these things. But that's not to say that there aren't things to be done, and things are being done. So one of the things that we realized from these incidents was that there was a massive failing by the school. The teachers had no idea how to deal with these incidents, and time again we see complaints made to teachers about anti-Semitic bullying and harassment, and they're waved away or ignored or wound up in some bureaucratic bungle and they're never dealt with. So we want to see better training of teachers to understand the processes by which they have to deal with this immediately. And we've been dealing with state departments, departments of education and school boards around the country to get better outcomes in this regard. We have to see punishment of people who do this. So in the incidents in Melbourne, one of the most appalling consequences of that was the 2 Jewish students who were targeted ended up leaving the school. What should happen is that the people who bullied them and harassed them should leave the school and not the victims. So we've raised this with the state government and we want to see redress, and there will also be legal action brought by the families to receive compensation, hopefully. Another thing that we can do is education. And we talk about it a great deal, but really I think ultimately it's the best tool that we have. I mean, so many people scoff at the Holocaust and laugh about it and mock people because of it without a true understanding of what Nazism is, what genocide is, and what occurred in those years. And I think the more that we can instill better Holocaust education and anti-racism education throughout the school system, the more we can drive away the ignorance from which these sorts of incidents stem. There's no perfect cure to this. We have to be conscious of that. But there is more that can be done, and we are doing it at the moment.
Thank you, Alex. Can I have another? Is there another question, please? Can you come forward? Thank you. We have another question, Alex.
Hi, Alex. Thanks very much. My name's Graham Baynard, and I was just wondering whether you could comment on my cousin Peter Baynard's recent publication in the New York Times suggesting that the solution to the Israeli problem would be to create an Israel-Palestine binational state. Thanks very much.
Peter Beinart's your cousin?
Yes. What can I say?
Well, I have to say I profoundly disagree with Peter Beinart. So just to sum up the thesis of what he was saying, Peter Beinart has been kind of a leader of liberal Zionist thought in the United States for a number of years. He published a book called The Crisis of Zionism about a decade ago, and from that stemmed a move by progressive Jews to boycott Israeli settlements. And more recently, he's had another kind of evolution in his thinking, and he's now opposed to the existence of a Jewish state per se, and he's calling for one state between the river and the sea, and effectively the extinguishment of Jewish national self-determination. Now, I profoundly disagree with him, and mainly on the basis of the sorts of assumptions that he makes that lead him to his conclusion. So the first thing that he argues is that Zionism never required a Jewish state. It merely required a Jewish home. And so as long as Jews have a home in this new fused binational state, that still satisfies the theories of Zionism. Now that is patently false. You can take quotes of Zionist leaders out of context, which seem to indicate support for a Jewish home or some formulation that is less than a state. But we know from a study of Zionist history, from the speeches, from the submissions, and most importantly from the decision-making of Zionist leaders, that it was always about a Jewish state. Only a Jewish state could secure Jewish national self-determination, allow Jews to preserve themselves, their future, their contribution to humanity, and allow them to determine their own political status. Weizmann said that if Jews aren't a healthy majority in the new state, they will merely transfer the diaspora existence from one place to another. It was always about a Jewish state. In 1947, when the UN proposed partition of Palestine and the creation of 2 states for 2 peoples, at that time, a binational state was also being considered. And Ben-Gurion said that in that situation, the Jews would be subservient to the Arabs in every realm of society, that it had to be avoided at all costs. It was always about a Jewish state. So that is one of the core assumptions that Beinart makes that is false, and everything that comes from that is false also. And the second thing that I think he bases his whole thesis and argument on, I think to Peter Beinart, he looks at Israel as a failure. He looks at it as a great disappointment. And when you combine those 2 things, his belief that Israel never had to be a Jewish state and that Israel has failed as a project, it naturally draws him to conclude that the whole thing needs to be dismantled and reorganized by the international community and enlightened American Jews on the Upper West Side. This is what he concludes. But to me, I look at Israel, and for all its faults and for all its poor decision-making at times, I think it is an extraordinary success to have a state reconstituted on the same place from which its people were evicted 2,000 years prior. To have this country being powerful, self-sufficient, diplomatically assertive, militarily stronger than all of its enemies combined, an economic powerhouse, an innovative powerhouse, I think what that country's achieved in 70 years is truly astounding. So I disagree with Peter Beinart on many reasons, on many grounds, but particularly for the assumptions that he makes that lead him to his conclusion. No offense to your cousin, though.
Thank you. Mindful of time, I have one more question. I've raffled it. So while you're coming up to it, can I also just recognise, Alex, you mentioned and I mentioned at the beginning of the proceedings, Mr. Simon Millman, MLA, a Member of Parliament of our government, and the roles that he played with his government in getting the grant for the new Jewish Centre and the Holocaust Centre, and he has arrived. So in your recognition of him, and I did, thank you, Simon, for your attendance.
Yeah.
Alex, it's Kelvin here. This time I'll ask you the question, not the other way around. In the event of Mr. Biden winning the election, how could that potentially affect Israel and US relations?
Firstly, good to see you again, Kelvin, and thank you for the question. Look, it's hard to predict. I think that Joe Biden is no foe of Israel. I think he has very close and warm relations with the American Jewish community. I've spent a great deal of time with what you might call the Jewish establishment in America, and they have a very, very fond and positive view of Joe Biden. He speaks at many Jewish events, and he recalls, he has anecdotes about Golda Meir, I'm told, that he shares all the time. He has a very fond feeling towards Israel. His running mate Kamala Harris also has very good and close relations with AIPAC, with JNF and groups like that. So I think in that ticket we have little to fear. I think the concern comes with maybe a broader shift in the Democratic Party, in the grassroots, and some of the people being elected to Congress that hold hard left views and are trying to take the party with them. But I think we have to realize that while we get very worked up about this and rightly concerned about it, particularly having seen what happened in the UK under Jeremy Corbyn, I think we have to understand that overwhelmingly the Democratic Party remains the home of the American Jewish community. They're comfortable within it. And it's of paramount importance not to turn our collective backs on any institution, let alone one as powerful as the Democratic Party. I think it's vitally important to work within that organization, work with the many friends and allies we have there to strengthen support for Israel, deepen it, and oust those extreme forces that would have the party turned on Israel. So I think we have little to fear in a Biden presidency. I think there might also be a positive consequence that will come from it, that in a kind of roundabout way. When you look at Donald Trump and his policy making with regards to Israel, if you look at the policies themselves, they're pretty flawless. You know, withdrawing the United States from the Iran deal, which was a failure, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, now brokering this peace with the UAE. These are landmark achievements. And arguably, this president has done more for Israel than anyone before him. However, and this is the thing that always concerned me with Donald Trump, he is such a polarizing figure that any cause to which he's attached or with which he's identified is immediately loathed and detested by half of the country and perhaps half of the world. And the more that he's seen as brazenly, openly, unapologetically pro-Israel, I worry what that will do long term to grassroots support for Israel, bipartisan support for Israel, things that we value and cherish and need to fight for. So I think, you know, Donald Trump has been very good, but I think Joe Biden could be good as well. But I think we need to be cognizant of these kind of long-term trends and how they play out also.
Thank you, Alex. Alex, at the opening of our meeting, we had an election of a new committee, and I'm going to ask our new chairman-elect, Dr. Sherry Sufi, if he will give a vote of thanks in closing for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Alex, can you hear me from here? Or?
I can, Sherry.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, I'll just speak from here and I'm close to the laptop. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for your unwavering services to this organisation. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to continue to work with you in a different capacity. I also want to acknowledge and thank all of my colleagues, past and present, Craig, Vice Chairman, Steve Lieblich, Michael Sutherland at the back there, Joanna Fox, and all the ones that haven't been nominated this AGM. I also want to thank them for their services and acknowledge their efforts in services to the Jewish community and advancing the interests of Zionism. It was said earlier this afternoon that we are a bipartisan organisation, and in the interest of bipartisanship, I do want to acknowledge the local MP, Simon Millman from the Labor Party, and there is plenty of presence here from both sides of politics, which is exactly what this organisation is about. So I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues here as well. Susie McDowell, the Liberal candidate for Mount Lawley, Simon Ehrenfeld, the Liberal candidate for North Metro. I know that we have Jim Seth, Liberal for Mount Morley, and Anthony Spagnolo, the Liberal candidate for the seat of Riverton. This is a spirit of bipartisanship that I endeavour to see develop and grow even stronger from strength to strength. So in thanking all of you, my colleagues, and our community representative from both sides of politics, and in thanking our guest speaker, who happens to be a very good friend of mine, Alex and I have run many forums together in person as well as online. We organised a very big debate a couple of years ago, where Alex was a star representative from the Israeli side of the argument. The video is available online, and I encourage you all to check it out if you haven't already done so. Earlier this year, when we confronted this COVID environment that we've been in, Alex and I organised another webinar with a very large audience, online audience, explaining Zionism, talking about some of the arguments he's presented in his book. It is important for people to understand what Zionism is in the words of Zionists. What I mean by that is Zionism has a certain perception out there because for too long it's been described in the mainstream press in the words of non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. But nobody likes their words twisted. Nobody likes their story to be told by their opponents. And Zionists have the right to be heard in their own words. When you listen to Jewish people and what their history means to them, when you understand the challenges they've been through throughout history for 18 centuries, a period that can round off as 2,000 years, we then start to understand that need for Jewish people to have a homeland on their ancestral turf. And that's the vision that I bring to this organisation. So I will encourage you all to fill out a form. There's a form on each of your seats. You would have expected, you would have appreciated what Alex has had to say tonight. So do consider purchasing both of his books. I've read them, and I've actually written a review for the second of his two books. The first one's the Anti-Israel Agenda. The second one is Zionism, which is what he spoke about before. So if you can fill out that form, we'll collect it and put it in order in for you. And on that note, I'm going to pass it back to Kevin to declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And again, Alex, thank you very much for your time. You can shut down your system now, and we're going to close the meeting, the annual general meeting, and Alex's presentation. Thank you all for your attendance. Drive home safely and stay safe. I think that's the catchphrase today. We've been very lucky in this state, so let's keep it that way. Thank you, Steve, for helping organise the technology. And my colleagues, both past and new, thank you very much for the contribution you make in the interest of Friends of Israel.